Welcome to Washington Focus. I'm your host, TJ Martinell. With me is our reporter, Tim Clauser. And it seems like Sound Trans is going to be pushing out some projects out from, out to a time when many of us will not still be alive. Tim, tell us what's going on.
Yeah, I hope I'm alive by the time these projects are finished. But I know there's concerns among a lot of taxpayers that they might not be alive by the time they finish. What we're talking about here is ST3 Sound Transit's expansion plan that was approved back in 2016 by the voters at a price around, I think it was $53.6 billion at the time. Now they're getting recent estimates showing that essentially by the time they finish these projects, they expect the cost to be $34.5 billion over that figure that voters had approved uh, 10 years ago now. Now, at the time, it was framed as this 20 to 25-year expansion. And a few years ago, they pushed the timeline out to 2046. And now they're talking about pushing the timeline out to 2052 due to this budget shortfall. They're essentially saying pushing out the timeline would give them it would provide capital savings, but the capital savings is really just kicking down a bunch of these projects until they can find the money. But it essentially has taxpayers paying longer for these light rail expansion projects, despite these projects coming out decades late. Like there's several transit advocates that were in the Sound Transit Committee meeting yesterday where they discussed this proposal, where they were in support of the expansion and they want it, but they said, look, you keep pushing the timeline, you're giving us these numbers and just expect us to blindly trust them. I mean, they're saying, look, I'm in my late 20s, some of them are in their early 30s and their 40s. They said, by the time these projects are finished, am I even going to be alive? I mean, during the meeting, you have all these executives of Sound Transit. They're going to vote on this proposal at the end of the month. And one of them is Katie Wilson, the mayor of Seattle. And she said, you know what? What we really need to do to stay on track is explore more progressive revenues and get the state to give us a 75-year bonds. And this proposal came up during the last legislative session, TJ. I'm sure you're aware of it, but it would allow government agencies to go after general obligation bonds, but instead of having them repaid over 20 to 40 years, which is typically the standard period, it would allow it for up to 75 years. So if that passed, had Sound Transit put something on the ballot today and we passed it, we would probably die before that project is finished and eventually repaid off. Not to mention the fact that when you extend the repayment period decades, that's billions of dollars that taxpayers then have to pay off in additional interest because they've pushed that repayment period. But essentially, Sound Transit is considering this proposal that would take all of these projects that were in ST3 and lump them into categories where we have the money to pay for this. We have the money to pay for the design and planning phase. We don't really have money for construction right now, and we're deferring the rest of these projects until we're able to find any funding for them. So they're saying the financial plan would run through 2052. It looks like when ST3 might be done, but they don't have hard timelines around a lot of these projects. So we're potentially running into a situation where a few years from now, Sound Transit could be kicking the can down the road again, and
Right.
taxpayers are just left to pay with it because there's no sunset clause on these taxes.
And that kind of goes to the point that has really been raised by critics of these packages is that when voters approved SG3 in 2016, they didn't approve projects. They didn't approve bus rapid transit. They didn't approve light rail projects. That's not what they approved. What they approved were new taxes, and those taxes don't have to pay. Like Sound Transit can change all these projects, as we're literally talking about right now. And so what that means is that they could scrap a bunch of these projects or they can just delay indefinitely the implementation. Because when ST3 was approved and when it was being discussed and debated, that's how long I've been covering this issue. Um, they were talking about stuff being done in 2041. And it's, granted, just to keep in mind, that was in 2015, 2016, and they're talking about getting stuff done in 2041. And so it seems like voters and a lot of people who are advocates for this stuff to realize they're voting on things that are allegedly going to be completed when if you're 20, you're going to be reaching almost retirement age by the time this stuff's done. And the other issue is, by the time this stuff is being worked on, what new technological changes with transportation will have come about that makes it where demand for these kind of projects is no longer needed. I mean,
Yeah. And
that's
I mean,
right.
oh, I was just gonna say, I mean, the voters, they don't really have any input or opportunities to weigh in on this really outside of showing up to public meetings and saying, look, I'm pissed off, because without that sunset clause, which wasn't included in 2016, they have no way to say, hey, you've been collecting our taxes for 10 years now. We're going to renew this and you have to do X, Y, and Z for us to renew it. They're just left paying for these. And Sound Transit says, look, we're committed to rolling back these taxes after we're done with ST3, but the can just keeps getting kicked down the road further. So
Right.
a lot of people are skeptical whether or not they're ever going to live up to that promise.
Right. And the thing is that the people who approved these taxes could have moved. They could have either left the taxing district and moved to some other part of the state, or just left the state entirely. I mean, it's kind of amazing how SG3 is a tax that was imposed by voters in 2016, but the tax remains in place regardless of where those voters go. So, they move out of state, they move out of the district, they move somewhere else. That the taxes remain in place on the property, on your vehicle tabs, on the sales tax. That's there in perpetuity, at least for the next, by what they're playing for the next 30 years, you know?
Yeah.
And
I mean, and at the same time, you have Katie Wilson talking about adding more progressive revenue options for Sound Transit.
I
They're
know.
looking at this big shortfall. And I mean, yeah, they can push the timeline out and say maybe we'll find more funding, or maybe all of a sudden our tax revenue will go up all of a sudden. But it's hard to imagine that happening unless they implement another tax. And what's going to happen? They're going to say, "Hey, we're going to roll back all these tax increases that you approved back in 2016 once we finish these projects, but at the same time, we're asking the state to extend the bond period and potentially give us other funding options as well." Are they going to roll those back after they finish ST3? I mean, they're already talking about ST4. They're not even done with ST3. There's several projects that are being delayed and deferred as part of this proposal
Right.
potentially, that were promised before ST3. Before voters approved them in 2016, they said, hey, we're going to do these projects. And now those are being kicked down the line even further. So you had people at the meeting saying, hey, look, you told me I was going to get this before I even approved ST3. And now you're saying it's going to be even longer.
Yeah. And what's so interesting is that Sound Transit's history has been one of consistently, um, for lack of a better word, over promising, under delivering, longer time than they said it would take, and costing more than they said it would. Like, this just consistently from the beginning, with starting with the first Sound Transit package, and then you had ST2, which had all sorts of problems as well. And now there's ST3, which is having just as many problems. I mean, and this is for light rail. And so the question is, what's going to be the benefit for all the cost and the money? And there's so many other angles to look at. And it's just interesting how, um, it goes back to the fact that voters approve tax packages with these things. They do not approve projects. Sound Transit, the board can amend any project they want. They can get rid of projects. They can pretty much do whatever they want. So voters think that they're voting for a light rail line, or a bus rapid transit, or a rail. Like, there's the Sounder, the train service. That's not what you approve at the ballot box. What you approve is whether or not to have a tax. And what's done with that money and that revenue is decided by the Sound Transit Board. So, Tim, we appreciate your coverage on this. It's this issue is not going away anytime soon, if not in our lifetime.
At
So
least until 2052, if they approve this plan at the end of the month.
right, right. So we'll be providing coverage as long as we're sticking around. So listeners can keep up with this story at thecentersquare.com and other stories as well. I'm your host, TJ Martinell. Thank you for listening to this episode of Washington in Focus.